Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio is Amanda Jeppesen. How are you doing today, Amanda?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing really good. So last weekend, I had the opportunity of attending the Midwest Academy of Management Conference in Moorhead, Minnesota, and it was a great time. I was able to present my work. I was able to learn about other research that people were doing, but I had the opportunity to sit down at a table, and I just happened to talk to the interesting people around me, and one of those people was Amanda. And throughout the weekend, we were talking about what we were working on, and on my little name tag, they had little, what would you call them, ribbons of
Yeah, ribbons, I think.
yeah, little ribbons of
Mhm.
first time conference, presenter, conference chair. And one of them said, "Have you read my blog?" Because I felt like that was the only one that I really liked and applied to me. So she asked about it. And I said, "Well, I do have this blog, Psychology of Business. I'd love to have you on." So me and Amanda have gone back and forth a couple times. And I said, I wanted to bring her on and I wanted to just talk about what she's passionate about. So, Amanda, do you want to talk about what you're passionate about and what you're working on in a scholarly capacity, but also at work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great to meet you. And I had the first time attendee ribbon, so it was kind of fun to match up ribbons and see how that went. So I am a PhD student at Western Michigan University. And the thing that I'm super passionate about personally, professionally, and scholarly is access and inclusion. So when I talk about access and inclusion, they're two different things, but they're tied together very closely. The reason that I am so passionate about these two things is it's very personal to me. So, myself and most of my family and most of my friends, in some capacity or another, are touched by things like disability, mood disorders, different ways that different lenses we have, different experiences. And so, my whole life, I've been operating in the way that allows me to accommodate other people and include them. And it's helped me see that when we accommodate and when we include, all of us benefit and we actually all have a much better time. We have a lot more fun. We're able to exchange more information and become a stronger unit. So let me explain what I mean by access and by inclusion. So when we talk about access, we're talking about the ability for many people to join, to partake, to access either an experience, a resource, information, or knowledge. When we talk about inclusion, that means after they access the thing, they're able to actually do it, partake in it, be included, feel represented, or lend their voice. I work with somebody who I think she uses a really great metaphor where, access is being invited to the dance, being able to go to the dance, but inclusion is being asked to dance and dancing with people. And so that's why I'm passionate about it. That's what I mean when I talk about those things. And the way that I enact access and inclusion is I look at structures and I look at systems. And so that's how I approach those things.
I think that's a great definition because when I was researching this topic, accessibility and inclusion are very similar, but it was hard for me to really grasp what the difference was. So, could you give us specific examples of work that you're doing? So we talked about the theory in kind of a abstract definitional way, but what are some actual things that you're doing to promote inclusion and accessibility?
Yeah. Access and inclusion in my work looks different than in a lot of other people's work. So one of the key lenses that so I'm studying organizational change leadership. And one of the scholarly lenses that I bring to that work is adult education or andragogy. And a lot of times in my work, I am focusing on managers of part-time employees of like a transient workforce. And when we look at the part-time employees in a transient workforce in the United States, a lot of times the people that make up those populations, this might be their first job. And so they might not know what you and I might consider professional norms that we all take for granted. And so when we look at things like interviews that make or break whether or not we're going to bring somebody into our company, when we're talking about access and inclusion, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take that adult education lens and I'll be talking to managers. And they'll be like, oh, I can't find anybody to work. No one's passing the interview. And so when I'm talking to these managers, I'm asking them to really step back and consider not just the words on the job description, but let's think about the actual work and the responsibilities that you're asking these people to perform. And then when we really get down granularly, what are you actually asking them to do? Let's think about what prior knowledge or skills and experiences do these people actually need to have? And what could that look like? For example, there was one entry level part time transient worker job that required them to teach people how to use a software. And a previous, minimum requirement was like must have 3 to 5 years of software experience. And I went, are you going to get somebody into this part-time role that is going to have 3 to 5 years? And also the age group you're looking at, I don't think they would have legally been allowed to work for that long. So when you're asking a question in an interview, rather than, prove to me that you have 3 to 5 years of experience, it's, hey, tell me about a time that you taught somebody how to use a technology they weren't familiar with. And then I challenged the hiring managers. I said, what kinds of examples do you think you can look for? And it was great because we had a really, really in-depth conversation. And they came to the conclusion that, like, yeah, if they taught their grandmother how to use her iPhone, that is the kind of experience of being able to translate a technology into a frame of reference that makes sense for somebody else. And that would be a perfectly acceptable answer. And so that's the access part. That really broadened that pool. And then when we talked about inclusion, I said, let's look at your materials and where do your training materials need to start so that somebody coming in with the base knowledge that you've determined is acceptable, that they can learn how to teach that technology in the way that's acceptable to you as the hiring manager.
Something that you introduced off camera when we were talking is you said that the coronavirus pandemic has kind of derailed the work that you've been doing. How has that impacted it, and how are things different now from before the pandemic to what you see now?
Yeah, I am going to get excited about my topic, so I want to preface this with saying that the pandemic was horrific and a lot of people died, and we need to understand the gravity of that. So please, no one mistake how excited I get about access and inclusion and how I'm going to talk about this opportunity that the pandemic gave us. That's not because I'm excited about what happened. So okay, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the status quo. Like, things are the way things are, and that's just the way they are. What happened with the pandemic, especially with business culture, is the status quo went out the window in many respects. And they went, oh my goodness, we're going to have to figure out how to get our work done completely differently. And so I approach my scholarship from a historical lens in many cases. So I really value understanding the root of a system. And so if we look back at the roots of many of the systems that we have here in the United States related to employment, many of them came out of the Industrial Revolution, where, you had to go to work to do the thing. You were like shoveling coal, or you were building a thing, or you were, working in a factory. And so the root of everything is everybody comes to a building and they all produce whatever you're producing that day. And we've carried that structure into the modern day because why change it if it works? But who did it work for? It worked for people that had the ability to go to a place, they had the ability to enter a place, they had the ability to do physical labor. We are now, and have been for a while, in a knowledge economy, but we didn't necessarily change our physical work structures to match the concept of the knowledge economy, partly because the people that ran the knowledge economy never had to think twice about how they were running it, right? So pandemic happens, we're all at home, we're like, oh my goodness, how do we do this? So people that otherwise would not have thought about how to restructure or reframe work suddenly had to figure it out on the fly. And there are some pockets of the economy, there are some sectors, there are some employers that had already made a shift to things like remote work or flexible work arrangements, but we did so in mass. And I wish I had thought to look up this statistic because I didn't. But I've read some literature that talked about how we have people with disabilities in the workforce at historically high rates. Just as one example of how switching to what ended up being a much more accessible and inclusive way to do work for many people really benefited not only a certain population, but also employers. We have data. Again, I don't have the source and I apologize. But we have data that also shows that people with disabilities, if they get a good job and they have a good experience, they're going to stay. And we can extrapolate this. It's not necessarily just the people with disabilities, but if you think of people that had young children, if you think of people that had elder care, if you think of people that just, used to have to commute an hour each way and now they didn't. So that's one of the ways. There are a lot of different ways, but from a structural perspective, that's one of the big shifts coming out of COVID.
So that's something really interesting because coronavirus pandemic hit March 2020. My school, I was actually finishing up my MBA at the time, right before I was going to start my PhD.
Yeah.
I switched online. We already had Canvas in place. We did have Microsoft Teams, but we didn't really use it. Today, some classes are exclusively on Microsoft Teams. People are using that technology, but we've also seen some pushback with companies trying to go back into the office. And then sometimes it's almost like the pendulum swung too far of let's have everyone online to it swung back to let's have everyone in office. And I think people are still trying to figure out what the correct number of days of work is. Because personally, I'm in a situation where I wouldn't be able to work from home. I have a young family right now, and that just, I could lock myself in my office, but just the way that my family dynamic is, it'd be difficult for me to work from home. But I have a brother-in-law who works exclusively from home. So when the pandemic hit, he actually moved across the country and he's working in a job that doesn't require him to be in office somewhere, but he still has good relationships with his coworkers. He tells me all the time, he's like, oh, I have to work late for this person, or I have to, this person's covering for me. So as someone who studies organizational behavior, obviously one thing that's on my mind is how's that going to impact culture? How is the method of work going to impact culture? And I think there has been a lot of work done with this, but talking about accessibility and inclusion, how do you feel like companies are responding to that demand to go back into the office? Do you find like some have decided to stay out of the office? Do you feel like some are trying to move people back in? What are some trends that you've seen?
I have not followed the trends that closely, kind of like the headlines and that. But one thing I will say is, I know, yes, when the pendulum swings one way, we obviously tend to overcorrect and swing another way. That being said, I think some of what we're seeing, I talked a little bit about the historic structures that we had for work. We also have the historic structures of management. So I'm sure most of us, or many of us, maybe just the two of us, depending on who's in the audience, are familiar with Chin and Ben and their three styles of leadership. And so one is that command and control. And that used to be like I think it still is kind of the big one, where it's like, no, I see you doing the thing and I'm going to tell you yes or no, and then I'm going to make you change or continue to do the thing. And that's obviously not going to work in a hybrid or a remote work environment. But if our managers and our leaders have not made the shift themselves or thought about a different way to manage, then obviously they're going to go, I can't see you. I can't prove in a knowledge economy unless I can actually see your output. I can't prove that you're doing anything. And so I also think that brings us to a point where we need to start thinking about how we're quantifying output or quantifying the value, qualifying the value of the labor that we're doing, and figuring out different ways. Like if I'm not manufacturing iron bars, you can't count the number of iron bars. Like you could count the number of emails that I'm sending. But unless you can quantify or qualify that email had value, I could send 700 emails. That's just a smiley face, tell you I sent 700. So it's also forcing people to reconsider what are we controlling and how are we measuring it. In terms of trends, that's something that I need to look at, because I would be interested to see the trends in different industries. You brought up a really good point about people that can and cannot have remote jobs. So my job, I can't be remote most of the time. I'm working very heavily with people face to face. When we're talking about healthcare, I really don't want my surgeon to be working from home on the day that I need to have surgery. And so that does require more exploration. And that also brings us to the area of equity, which is a entirely, it's related, but it's a whole other conversation. So have you noticed any trends either way in your research?
Um, I think that people are still trying to figure it out right now. Obviously, some organizations have moved to a remote or hybrid model, and it sounds like they're going to stay there. But
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen some organizations wanting to come back into the office, because I think you do lose something when people aren't physically in the office. But at the same time, if you have people who are around the world that can bring in people from different locations, that can bring in someone who traditionally may have not been able to work in the office, like the accessibility you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But a question I do have for you is, we've been
Yeah.
talking about this on kind of a broad, macro, zoomed out scale, but how can if I were a manager, how can I implement what you're researching, what you're working on now in my groups and in my organizations that I'm working in right now? How can I make this applicable to my day-to-day life?
Well, that depends on what kind of power you have in your organization at your level. So let's assume that you have a modicum of power. Let's say that you have the autonomy to run your team the way that you want to run your team. Because the very first thing that I would say is, what's your organization doing? What does the upper level of leadership expect from you? And what kind of culture are they creating that you need to work within? Because there's only so much that you can do unless you are the person that is completely in charge. So let's remove that. Let's say that you have the ability to run the team the way you want to. What I would do is I would look at what everybody's expectations are in their role and what their output is. And I would just look at it from a very real, like, gut check. What do I think these things are? And then I would go through them again. Um, we have a team that has a number of different functional areas. And so this kind of gets into equity and how it's good, and it's also very difficult. These functional areas have different expectations about whether they need to be in or not. And there's a lot of conversation that we're having, because the functional areas are different, but some of them overlap. And so you as a manager, um, you know, who are they interfacing with? Like, who are their stakeholders? Where are their stakeholders? Would it be appropriate to have a virtual interaction with those stakeholders, or is it absolutely business critical that those interactions be in person with those stakeholders? Because sometimes the answer is yes, you absolutely have to be in person. I would look at how you're measuring their output right now, and I would see whether or not that's actually the best measurement of their work. Some people might look at somebody that does a lot of face-to-face interaction and go, I right now am counting the number of meetings that you're having per week, and I'm using that as your measurement of success. But if you're having those meetings to run a program, should I actually be looking at the outputs of the program to measure your success? Because if I'm going to make you go have these meetings face to face because I like that you have meetings face to face, but your program's failing, I think I might be measuring the wrong thing. The other thing that you have to take into account is physical resources. So if you're like, okay, great, I can send my whole team home and all of them can work remotely, do you have the equipment to send home with them? Do you have the stopgaps in place? Like, if somebody doesn't have internet at their house, let's say they've always worked at home and they first don't stream or do anything at home. Is there an internet stipend? Are you able to cover that? So it's not only assessing the team and the inputs and the outputs, but then it is taking it a couple steps further and looking into the actual physical structures.
So it sounds like a lot of your work has to do with reframing expectations.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's true?
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like a lot of it has to do with reframing expectations. And that reminds me of something, the principal agent problem. So principal agent problems, essentially where a manager or business leader has different objectives than someone on the front line. If I'm the CEO of McDonald's, for example, I'm going to have different objectives than the cashier who's working day to day. But taking that on a smaller scale, if I'm, the manager and I want my employees to make sales, then I need to somehow I need to somehow incentivize the structures in place that will allow them to make more sales. If it's simply them, just the number of cold calls they make, or the number of cold emails that they send, just like what you said, they can send smiley faces, but that's not really going to matter.
Yeah.
Well, if we transfer the industrial revolution economy into the knowledge economy, yes, the number of iron bars that I made is, my productivity. But if I'm someone who maybe sends out 20 emails a day, but if the conversion rate is a lot higher, then that's going to be a lot more beneficial. So from our discussion, that's kind of what I've taken away from this. But I think something that we should go towards next. You talked about equity a couple times.
Yeah.
Do you want to move into there? Do you want to give us an overview of how equity plays into what you're doing?
Sure. Equity is different than equality. Equality is everybody gets the same thing. Equity is everybody gets what they need to achieve the same goal or meet the same expectation. So I have chronic migraines, and occasionally they disrupt, more than occasionally, they disrupt my life, and occasionally they disrupt me professionally and as a student. And so while I might be, if you and I are in the same class, and let's assume that your health is top shape, equality would be we need to be in class 5 days a week from 10 to 10:50. Equity would be I have a migraine. I can still function, but I have to function at home in my bed. Can I please dial into class? That's equity. I'm still going to class. I'm still getting my attendance grade. I'm still getting the knowledge that I need to produce the paper. We see that a lot with, in the academic realm or even in the professional realm. One of the most common accommodations to create equity for folks with ADHD or learning disabilities is more time on tests. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, isn't that cheating? It's no, if their brain takes, 25% longer to grasp something or 25% longer to take the test, that 125% amount of time might be the same as my 100% of time. I just don't need that extra 25%. And so that's the difference between equity and equality. And equity is really hard because if you see me being able to go home and do class from my bed and you'd rather be in bed, then you're kind of like, but why do I have to be here? And so that's where it gets really tough.
So how do we solve that? Because I think people are going to push back. Obviously, the example you gave. Oh, if you can work from bed, if you can have an extra 25% of time on the test, how do we combat that? Because obviously, people need accommodations. Some people may have chronic migraines, like in your example. Some people may have neurodivergence. Some other people may have other reasons why they need accommodations. And I think most people are understanding of that. But in the workforce or when we're talking about class, it definitely is going to be a challenge. So how do we address some of those challenges? Because I think people may perceive it as unfair, but obviously, some things need to be done.
Yeah. The answer, nobody likes this answer, but it's my answer, and it's an idealistic answer, but nothing ever got changed by maintaining the status quo. So I had a professor who's actually the dean of our college now. So that's kind of a fun full circle moment. My undergraduate education was in K through 12 education, English and Spanish. And one of the classes I took was special ed. And it was for non-special ed teachers because in the state I live in, they mainstream special ed kids as much as possible into mainstream classes. And this teacher said, everybody would be better off if they had an IEP, an individualized education plan, because a fun fact about the public education system in the US, it was built to Americanize immigrants on the East Coast. That's why we have bells. It's so that when you hear a bell, you change your task. It also is kind of why sometimes you just get enough English or just enough math in order to function at a factory job. So that being said, that ties back into what I was talking about with the way our work systems are designed back in the Industrial Revolution. And so the answer that would bring equity is that everybody gets accommodations. Does our current system, do our current leaders, does the current power structure allow for that? It doesn't. And so the realistic answer is that I don't know how to do this. I have tried to figure out how to do it. I am actively, attempting to figure out how to do it. Um, I think one of the key elements of this is communication, because if you found out that I was in bed because I had a horrible migraine, and that's why, then you may or may not be like, ooh, well, I don't want that. Like, I guess I can go into class because the rule is I need to go into class. But if you're like, I'd rather be in bed because of this other reason why I need accommodations, you should get accommodations. It does require the people in power to completely reinvent or rethink a system. And that's why I couched my answer in nobody likes this answer, and it isn't necessarily realistic. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, because I'm always looking for answers.
I think in a perfect world, everyone would have an IEP, an individual education plan, or maybe an individual employee plan if we
Yeah.
applied to the business world.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that, let's say 90% of people can achieve what's expected of them at the status quo? And
Mm-hmm.
that's not a, let's say, statistically significant number that we need to provide those accommodations. So if we take the people on the fringes, like those, like what we talked about earlier, it isn't causing a big enough dent in the bottom line for organizations to actually worry about. Because I think about, me as a professor, I think about the accommodations I give my students. I think about accommodations that are given in workforces so that, that things do work for the majority of people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to flip that around, because if we think about the 10% of people, or whatever the percentage is, who actually need those accommodations, um, what do we do about that? And I think questions like this are important, that we need to talk about, but if we had solved them, they wouldn't be a problem. And it might be one of those things where it can never be solved, where we can move things in the right direction, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
think there's ever going to be a time where things get solved. Because I think you think back 100 years ago, 200 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, when things were just getting taken off, you had to work on your farm, you had to work in the mill, you had to do X, Y, and Z to actually survive. And if
Mm-hmm.
you didn't go out and you didn't hunt, you didn't provide, you didn't garden, you didn't whatever, you wouldn't be able to survive. And I think one of the amazing things about having a developed economy is that we can support people who can't do those things. But we've never had an environment where, if someone can't go out to work because they have migraines, or someone can't work because, maybe they have vision impairment, or maybe they can't hear as well, maybe 500 years ago, they literally wouldn't have survived. But now today, one of the great things we have is that people are actually able to participate. But being able to participate is going to introduce issues. So what do we do about that? That's an issue. So one thing that I talk about in my principles of management class is we talk about the Industrial Revolution, and we talk about some of the early management theories, which include the classical theories. And what they did is essentially they looked at people like cogs in a machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just want you to create as many iron bars as possible. But one issue with that is that viewing people as cogs in a machine forgets about their behavioral aspect of themselves. So one thing I point out to my students is that all the knowledge that we got from the Industrial Revolution is great, and they're the core of our management theory that we have today. But things are changing. Things are changing rapidly, and even in the last 5 years since the coronavirus pandemic, it's taken things almost like Y2K. That was a turning point for everyone going online.
Yeah.
But coronavirus 20 years later, that's a turning point for everyone, working online, almost, where people can do their job online. So what's the future going to look like? I don't know. I think that's a question everyone's trying to answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think that we're in a place where we have answers yet, because we are in the middle of such a dramatic shift, with tools that we don't necessarily understand. Like, I think about, a lot of my classmates are doing a lot with artificial intelligence, and I'm sure folks over in your institution are as well. And, there's a lot of literature out there post 2020 about human centered leadership and human centered design and human centered AI design and AI augmented human centered design. And what that tells me is that we're all talking about it, or many of us are talking about it, but you're absolutely right. We don't exactly know. And I think it's because 500 years ago, if you didn't grow your crops, you relied on your neighbor or you went hungry. And 70 years ago, or however long ago, if you made enough iron bars, you get paid. And now we're like, did I send enough emails that converted into enough sales? So I'm about to say it's interesting, and it's not interesting because this is actually like people's livelihood, but it's definitely a question that we're going to be wrestling with for a long time.
And I think coronavirus pandemic and the the AI coming on the scene happened almost at the exact same time. And it's where everyone switched to relying more on technology. But now we're to a point where technology's come out that has made things so much more efficient. That's, really revolutionized the way of the world. So at my institution, I teach and I try to have my students use AI. Obviously, I don't want them using it to actually write their papers for them. But I think it's going to get to a point in education where if ChatGPT is writing my paper, if I'm a student and I'm submitting it, and professors are using ChatGPT or using some type of AI to help them with grading, where's that human interaction? So it's almost like, have we reached a point where the pendulum of technology has swung so far? Do we need to go back to oral tests? Do we need to go back to handwritten tests? Do we need to go back to a lot of these different things? So one way that I've incorporated it in my class that I'm doing right now is instead of having them submit an analysis of their company, they have to actually make a podcast. I have interest in podcasting, obviously, but they can use AI to help with their outline and stuff, but they're the ones who have to say the words. Now that could change because I know there's AI that can like mimic voices and stuff. But I think these are all the unknowns. And looking back at this video, in 5, 10, 15 years, something may have come out that we're like, oh, that's so obvious. Why didn't they see it now?
Yeah.
But it's something that we have to grapple with right now. Those are the problems we're trying to solve.
They are. And I am excited to be in a position of studying this while it's happening. I'm also hoping that both of us are in a position where we can start to shape some of these things. I think we both care a lot about people in the workplace and people's well-being and the well-being of the country and the economy. And it's really cool to be looking at it while it's unfolding. So I don't know. I feel very privileged to be in this position, to be having conversations like these with people like you.
Yeah, even being able to talk about problems, being able to recognize the problems, being able to be in a position where we can try to solve problems is great.
Yeah.
So you're a doc student right now. You also work. So you kind of study and work all at the same time. So this is the question that all doc students hate. But what's your dissertation on? What do you want when you are come to the end of your program? What do you hope to really be focusing on? Because we've talked about equity, we've talked about access, we've talked about inclusion, but what is your big thing that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so right now I'm only 3 classes in, and so I'm trying to figure out what it's going to be about, but I have a feeling I keep gravitating toward power, which is very, very nebulous. And one thing that I found in my professional life is I keep getting put into positions or finding myself in positions where people go like, this didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. Why not? And I'm like, you had a lot of power in that situation and you could have made some different choices, or your power is influencing something that way. And one of my professors introduced me to the concept of organizational silence. And in all of my schooling and the way that I operate professionally is I'm looking for the things that people aren't saying. So kind of Robert Marshak's idea of covert processes, among other scholars, but he's the one that's been most influential to me. But the concept of who is not saying something and why, what are the conditions under which people aren't saying things? And so I think that's one of the ways I'm going. After, I would love to keep one foot in scholarship and one in practitioner. So scholar practitioner is the goal. No idea what that's going to look like. I think I'm out till like 2027 or something. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, those are the directions I think I'm going at this point. But, ask me in 2026 and we'll see what I say then.
So is the idea of organizational silence is it's someone's not talking because there's a reason why they're not talking? Is that kind of the...
Yeah.
And what is it? Because they have they're supposed to make a decision and they aren't, or they have information that's private, or what's the idea? Why is that so important to look at?
A lot of the conditions that cause organizational silence, and I will say a disclaimer for all of the educated folks, I have not dug into this topic very much. I'm talking very surface level. So just someone's going to come in the comments and be like, you're wrong. And I'm like, yeah, probably. But what I'm understanding so far is a leader or somebody with power has created an environment in which it is not safe to say something.
Mm.
And so looking again, it's kind of like looking sideways at power. Or I read an article recently that was really interesting about how secrecy is sometimes an important tool for middle managers in order to actually incubate an idea strategically long enough to make it worthwhile to show to leadership. And so again, that kind of plays into what are the conditions under which people are being silent or saying something.
Mm. Well, Amanda, in 3 years, when you have passed your comps, when your dissertation's written, I'd love to have you back on and we can talk about everything that you're working on.
I'd like that very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, big thank you to Amanda Jeppesen for coming on today and talk about what she's working on. I think you're doing some great work. I hope to see you again, whether it's at Midwest Academy of Management, whether it's on the show, or whether it's somewhere else. But Amanda, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. You have a great day and happy learning.